Vision a realm where kings were not just rulers, but deities themselves, venerated by their subjects. Picture throngs of enslaved people toiling under the relentless sun, constructing monumental cities that stood as testaments to the pharaoh's power. Within gilded temples, shrouded in secrecy, arcane rituals were enacted, offerings were made to gods with animalistic visages, and the very air thrummed with the energy of the unseen. This was Egypt, an empire of unparalleled grandeur and unsettling brutality. While the elite reveled in opulence, indulging in lavish feasts of wine, sensual dances, and opulent adornments, the Hebrew slaves were relentlessly driven, their backs bearing the marks of the whip as they erected the colossal cities that cemented the pharaoh's legacy. Did you know that ancient Egyptians believed in human sacrifice to guarantee safe passage to the afterlife? Priestesses dedicated their bodies as offerings in sacred rituals. Even the daily bread was not without its hazards, as the ever-present desert sands found their way into the dough, slowly eroding teeth with each bite. Prepare for a profound journey back in time as we delve into the realities of biblical Egypt. We'll explore the quotidian existence of the common Egyptian, unraveling the mysteries of their labor, sustenance, and social structure. Crucially, we'll examine the complex relationship between the Egyptians and the Hebrews, a narrative fraught with both cooperation and conflict. The revelations uncovered here may reshape your understanding of the Bible. But before we embark on this expedition, tell me in the comments from which city you are tuning in. I am eager to learn where the echoes of ancient Egypt reverberate today. What was biblical Egypt like? When the name evokes visions of colossal pyramids, majestic temples, and an arid desert landscape. But can we truly grasp the essence of this once mighty empire? The Egypt of biblical times was more than just pharaohs and opulent palaces. It was a civilization strategically positioned to flourish, thanks to the life-giving artery of the Nile, the world's most significant river. Nestled in the northeastern corner of Africa, Egypt became one of antiquity's most influential kingdoms, wielding power that stretched across vast distances. Here is a little-known fact. The Egypt of Joseph's time was not the same as that of Moses, nor the Egypt where the Holy Family sought refuge in the New Testament. This empire underwent profound transformations, passing through different phases and subjected to various dominations over centuries. In the days of the Old Testament, Egypt was ruled by autocratic pharaohs and sustained by a meticulously organized agricultural economy. The Nile was the lifeblood of the nation, its annual inundations fertilizing the land, ensuring bountiful harvests. In the New Testament era, Egypt fell under Roman dominion, ushering in significant changes to its culture and administration. However, one constant remained. The relentless desert and its extreme climate were perpetual challenges. Unlike many other regions, Egypt received scant rainfall. All life revolved around the Nile. Without it, survival would have been impossible. The intense heat dictated clothing choices. Linen, a light and breathable fabric, was the preferred material. Egyptians also employed fragrant oils to protect their skin from the sun and to repel insects. For centuries, the Hebrews lived as slaves in Egypt, enduring this harsh reality firsthand. While Egyptians dwelled in mud brick houses, the enslaved Hebrews often had to make do with paltry and inadequate shelter. This raises an essential question. What was life like within Egyptian society? How was it organized? What was the nature of work, the economy, and the social hierarchy? In the upcoming sections, we will immerse ourselves in this reality and discover what life was like for ordinary people in biblical Egypt. You will be amazed to learn that women enjoyed more rights than in many other civilizations of that time. Egypt was an agricultural and commercial powerhouse. The fertile soil, replenished annually by the Nile's floods, enabled the cultivation of wheat, barley, linen, and papyrus. Agricultural surpluses were used to feed the population, pay workers, and maintain the empire's wealth. However, this wealth was not accessible to all. The economic system relied on a rigid social structure and heavy taxation. Peasants toiled from sunrise to sunset, handing over a portion of their harvests to the government. Artisans crafted jewelry, ceramics, and luxurious furniture for the nobles. Merchants traveled through the desert, bringing spices and exotic goods. At the apex of this hierarchy stood the pharaoh, considered a living god who controlled the military, religion, and economy. Where did the Hebrews fit into this social pyramid? The Bible tells us that they were enslaved in Egypt and forced to labor on grandiose projects. While ordinary Egyptians had rights and could even ascend socially, slaves had no choice. Their days were marked by arduous work and servitude. Intriguingly, women in Egypt had more rights than in many other ancient societies. They could be merchants, scribes, and even rulers. Some women even ascended to the position of pharaoh, such as the famous Hatshepsut. However, Hebrew women did not enjoy these privileges and were treated as part of the servile class. If Egyptian society was so advanced, why did the Hebrews suffer so much there? What was the system of slavery in Egypt actually like? Were all slaves foreigners, or were there also Egyptians among them? The Hebrews were slaves. Slavery is one of the darkest stains on human history. What about in ancient Egypt? Were the Hebrews truly enslaved in the way we imagine? The Bible tells us that the Hebrews were subjected to a brutal regime of forced labor in Egypt. Exodus 1:13-14 describes it this way: "The Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor." Some modern historians debate how this slavery actually functioned in ancient Egypt. Servitude went beyond the traditional model of slavery. Not all forced laborers were chained prisoners. Many slaves were foreigners captured in wars, but there were also Egyptians who lost their freedom due to debt. The Hebrews were likely in this category of imposed servitude, living under a severe regime without any right to choose. The Pharaoh saw them as a threat because their numbers were growing rapidly. To control them, he decreed the death of their male babies, Exodus 1:22. The tasks the slaves performed were brutal. Many were forced to produce mud bricks and straw, essential for Egyptian constructions. Others worked on plantations, carried heavy stones for temples and monuments, and served in the houses of the nobles. It is important to note that the hardest work was not on the pyramids, as they were built many centuries before the time of Moses. During the time of the Hebrews, slave labor was more focused on erecting cities like Pithom and Rameses, Exodus 1:11. Not all servants lived in the same condition. Domestic servants who worked for noble families had a relatively more comfortable life, taking care of the house and helping with daily tasks. However, the vast majority faced a cruel reality marked by physical punishments and a life of extreme hardship. Egypt, which seemed like a paradise of wealth and grandeur, actually concealed a system of terrible oppression for those at the base of society. But God did not forget his people. The cries of the Hebrews rose to him, and the story of liberation was about to begin. How did God demonstrate his power before the Pharaoh? How did a simple man, Moses, confront the most powerful king on earth? In the next section, we will see how the Lord used plagues and supernatural signs to break the arrogance of Egypt and liberate his people. What was the role of women in Egypt? While many ancient civilizations treated women as mere property of their husbands or fathers, things were a little different in Egypt. Egyptian women had more rights than in many other cultures of the ancient world. Did this mean an easy life for them? Unlike what happened in many neighboring peoples, Egyptian women could own property, manage businesses, and even initiate divorces. Some became merchants, doctors, and priestesses, and in rare cases, even pharaohs, such as the powerful Hatshepsut, who ruled as king, defying male traditions. This apparent freedom had its limits. Egyptian society was still patriarchal, and the destiny of most women was marriage and motherhood. Many were forced to marry early, and their value was measured by the number of children they could produce. If you think the royalty lived a perfect marriage, here is a shocking fact. Pharaohs often married their own sisters or half-sisters. Yes, marriage between siblings was common in the royal family because they believed it would keep divine blood pure. Marriage was less complicated among ordinary people. There were no religious ceremonies or elaborate contracts. The couple simply started living together, and this was already considered an official union. Divorce was permitted, and both men and women could request separation. What about Hebrew women? Their life in Egypt was not as privileged as that of Egyptian women. Being part of the servile class, they did not have the same rights. Many were forced into hard labor, while others served as maids in Egyptian houses. Their fate was determined by the lords who owned them. In the midst of this culture that mixed power and oppression, God was already preparing a great deliverance for his people. Violence, crime, and punishments in ancient Egypt. When we think of Egypt, we immediately imagine magnificent temples, colossal pyramids, and an advanced civilization. Behind all this greatness, there was a brutal justice system where punishment was swift, severe, and often merciless. In ancient Egypt, the law was controlled directly by the pharaoh, considered the incarnation of the god Horus. Challenging the established order meant challenging the gods themselves, and no one wanted to do that. Punishments varied according to the crime, but even minor infractions could be punished with brutality. Stealing food meant a public flogging. Lying to a superior could result in an ear being cut off. Being accused of treason almost certainly meant death, and not in any ordinary way. Some executions involved live burials, public burnings, or even being thrown to hungry crocodiles in the Nile. There was also a peculiar method of judgment, the river test. If someone was accused of a crime without concrete evidence, they could be thrown into the river. If they survived, they were considered innocent, but if they sank, Egyptian justice considered it a sign of guilt. Hebrew slaves had no protection. Physical punishments were common, and the life of a slave was worth little. If a worker proved to be weak, they could simply be replaced. Egypt was a land of wealth, but also of oppression. The absolute power of the pharaoh kept everyone under control, but one day a man would dare to challenge this system. A Hebrew raised in the pharaoh's own house would return to confront him with the authority of the Almighty God. Moses was about to change history. Before we talk about the plagues and the Exodus, there is another side of Egypt that few people know. Its relationship with pleasure, sensuality, and strange rituals that were part of Egyptian culture. There is a side of Egyptian culture that few people know, its view of sex and pleasure. Unlike many ancient societies that treated the subject with severity and taboo, the Egyptians had a much more open mind. Eroticism was part of daily life. Parties with wine, sensual dances, and fertility rituals were common even inside religious temples. Many celebrations included processions with statues of gods covered in sexual symbols, and some religious festivities had practices that would be seen as shocking today. There was something called sacred prostitution. Some women served in temples as part of fertility rituals. It was believed that sex in these contexts brought blessings and favored prosperous harvests. Pharaohs took this culture to an extreme level. Marriages between siblings were common to preserve the divine purity of the royal lineage. Incest within the royal family was not seen as something immoral, but as a duty. Egyptian art also reflected this naturalness in relation to sexuality. There are papyri and sculptures with explicit representations showing that sex was not a forbidden subject. On the contrary, it was seen as an essential part of life and even of spirituality. What does the Bible teach us about this? Egypt was a land of idolatry and immorality, and God warned his people not to follow the customs of pagan nations. In Leviticus 18:3, God orders, "You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you dwelt, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes." What does this teach us? God called his people to be separate, holy, and different from the world. While Egypt sank into carnal pleasures and idolatry, the Lord wanted the Hebrews to live in obedience and purity. Egyptians not only worshipped pleasure, they had one of the most complex and mystical religions of antiquity. Let's dive into the world of idolatry, sacrifices, and the obsessive search for life after death. Pagan rituals and religion in ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt was a land of mysteries and grandeur, but also of idolatry and spiritual beliefs that went far beyond what we can imagine. Its imposing temples, colossal statues, and elaborate rituals were not just culture. They were a reflection of a faith deeply rooted in polytheism and the search for life after death. Egyptians believed in hundreds of gods, each responsible for different aspects of life. Horus, the falcon god, symbolized royal power. Osiris, the lord of the underworld, judged souls after death. Ra, the sun god, was seen as the supreme creator. Idolatry went beyond the gods. Animals such as cats, crocodiles, and falcons were worshipped and even mummified as a form of devotion. At the center of all this worship was the pharaoh, considered a living god. He was not just a king, but the very incarnation of divinity on earth. Therefore, any threat against the pharaoh was seen as a direct challenge to the gods and was punished with extreme severity. There was something even darker: human sacrifices. Although not common, some ceremonies required human offerings, especially in funeral rituals or to seal alliances with the gods. Some pharaohs were buried with their servants, who were killed to accompany them in the afterlife. Egyptians also had an obsession with eternity. Mummification was a complex process that could take up to 70 days and involved removing internal organs to preserve the body. Rich and noble people spent fortunes building tombs full of wealth and amulets to ensure safe passage to the afterlife. Egypt was not just superstition. They had advanced knowledge of medicine and used herbs and honey to treat ailments. They even used moldy bread to treat infections, a practice that centuries later would lead to the discovery of penicillin. Despite all this knowledge, Egypt sank further into idolatry. And when the pharaoh dared to challenge the true God, the Lord sent powerful signs to show who was really in control. Egypt was one of the most powerful and influential empires of antiquity. Its culture, economy, and religion shaped the ancient world and even some passages of the Bible. Above all, Egypt teaches us a great spiritual lesson. No human kingdom, however glorious, can compare to the power of God. The pharaohs thought they were gods, but they were humiliated by the plagues. The Egyptians trusted in magic and amulets, but they could not stop the hand of the Lord. The people of God suffered for a time, but were freed with supernatural signs.